We are starting out D&D news this week with Larian Games and the upcoming release of Baldur's Gate 3, the very long-awaited sequel that is set to satisfy at least a majority of RPG gamers and Dungeons & Dragons aficionados the world over. So we don't really know a lot about the game at all. Of course, it was just announced at E3 in the Google Stadia presser back in June of 2019. But we have started to learn a few things over time as the studio has leaked or eked out details to the community at large. So we have no pricing or release date, but we do know that it's from Larian Studios, which is the studio behind probably what's being heralded as one of the greatest RPGs of our generation with the Divinity Original Sin series, specifically Divinity Original Sin 2. So Larian built both of these and all of the addendums in the Divinity catalog, which scored 90s across the board for a lot of very honest and objective critics that I place a lot of trust in, like Polygon, Metacritic, Destructoid, and even Game Informer. All loved it with 95s, 97s, and basically 90 plus. So that'll tell you a little bit about the type of quality that we've come to expect as RPG gamers from Larian Studios. And obviously, we hope or expect that to be carried through into this new iteration of the Baldur's Gate series. So two of the most important things that we have are a couple of videos that were released. Video number one I'm going to look at is a video where Larian Studios founder Sven Vink is standing before a boardroom and they're shouting at each other, and he's donning this plate mail armor and he holds above his head an iron flask and says, "I have the secret sauce for D&D." So obviously I was very interested to know what Larian Studios thinks the secret sauce for D&D is. Bound to polarize as everything, but hold up, it's coming. The video then clips to a shot of Sven and his colleague Gigi entering the Dungeons & Dragons corporate offices in Seattle, where they're met by the receptionist. And from there, they go into perusing the various nostalgia and sculptures and knickknacks that are there from the Dungeons & Dragons world. The receptionist, of course, tells them to not touch anything because they're not allowed to play with that. But not before Sven identifies the Iron Flask, which is an iconic magical item from the 5th edition DMG, which has the power to trap a creature. That's important later. So Gigi, of course, forms this brilliant distraction as Sven pockets the flask, and they go into their meeting with none other than Dungeons & Dragons creative director Mike Mearls. And of course, they make a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that people have been trying to license Baldur's Gate 3 forever. To be specific, Baldur's Gate 2 was released in the year 2000, so it's been 2 decades that fans have been waiting for this coming edition of Baldur's Gate 3, or someone worthy enough to create the damn thing. So from here, the video actually goes into a pretty informative piece about how Larian Studios won the licensing to create the game in association with Wizards of the Coast on a few key pillars that I'm taking as promises from the studio. And those are, it has to be a big, grand adventure. There's no small potato steaks at the table here for Baldur's Gate 3. It has to be true to Dungeons & Dragons lore. Of course, something that's so entrenched in the rich history of Faerun has to follow and deliver on that lore that fans expect and are so intrinsically invested in. Of course, player agency is key, and if you're familiar with the Divinity Original Sin and Divinity Original Sin 2, you'll know that there are mechanically lots of ways to do pretty much anything you want or behave in any way you want. So player agency is obviously important, as it is with our tabletop game. And then, of course, they have pretty high stakes and high expectations from both the owners of the IP and Larian as a very well-established AAA publisher. So the stakes are really high and the delivery has to be high to match. Now, Mike Mearls makes a joke about specifically making sure that seromorphosis is part of the process. And seromorphosis is the process whereby mind flayers actually replicate. So they infest humanoids with worms and, let's say, symbiotes that ultimately take over the humanoid's body and eventually transform them into a mind flayer. That's how they assimilate races. And from here, there are plenty of mentions or nods to mind flayers, or Illithid as they're called in the lore, and as it relates to this game of Baldur's Gate 3. We now know, of course, from the teaser trailers that mind flayers clearly play a pivotal role in this new arc. But it was interesting to see them kind of point to it as, the knickknacks on the shelf. One of them's a Mind Flayer. Mike Mearls takes them on a tour of the offices where they showcase the big Illithid, the Mind Flayer head that's mounted that you may have seen on Critical Role. And now, of course, the actual intentional message that Ceromorphosis also has to be part of the campaign direction. On that note, it ends with a really great little tour where they walk around the Dungeons & Dragons office in Seattle, so it's worth watching for that alone, even if you want to see kind of what goes on behind the walls. And invariably, Sven takes advantage of a distracted Mike Mearls to knock him out and entrap him in the Iron Flask. I'm not going to go into whether or not I think Mike Mearls is the secret sauce behind Dungeons & Dragons, so then it glides into a little bit more of a documentary-style stand and deliver where Sven and team are delivering some of the expectations that they actually do see coming into production for Baldur's Gate. They talk about regular progress videos coming out over their channels, new features and components that they're building into the game. So this is how they're going to release that material and information to the public as the game continues on its development path. He has said that it is the biggest and best RPG that Larian Studios has ever made, and they're doing so in super close collaboration with Wizards of the Coast. So hopefully that will be truly collaborative, and I'm going to inject my own opinion here. I really do hope that Wizards can trust the years of experience and the accolades that Larian has established for itself as a premium provider and developer of narrative-based role-playing games. They're going to do a fantastic job. I hope they'll be allowed to do the great job they know they can. It's a grand adventure filled with things to explore and experiment with, NPCs, challenging combat, memorable characters, and tough decisions, of course, that, if it's anything like Divinity, are irrevocable and have a tangible, lasting impact on the game world and the story you're going to experience. They also alluded that you can either play with a party or solo or multiplayer, and I imagine that this will probably follow suit as the Divinity series too. Video 2 that I looked at in greater detail was, of course, the recently released teaser trailer that shows us a lot more of the CGI version of what the game's going to be like. The teaser trailer for Baldur's Gate 3 shows in the beginning a weary knight who's clearly battered and bruised as he's stumbling through the ruined streets of Baldur's Gate. This knight is a member of the Flaming Fist. We can see that because he has the Flaming Fist emblem emblazoned on his chest. And the Flaming Fist is a mercenary company, one of two factions that provides security and peace inside the walls of Baldur's Gate, the other being the Watch. So immediately this character falls to his knees and begins the process of Ceromorphosis. From there, he goes into the painstakingly and clearly traumatic process of an accelerated transformation into a Mind Flayer. He rises as a completely transformed Illithid, begins to float from the ground and towards the camera in a very presumptuous and aggressive manner. Now, it's worth noting that in the background of that video, we see what looks to be some kind of colossal floating tentacled object in the sky, slightly obscured by some of the buildings. But if you look closely, it almost represents what some might say is the Stranger Things-esque version of the Mind Flayer that they call it. And all these humanoid shadows and shapes floating up into the sky. This actually has place in Illithid or Mind Flayer lore, and given that they have revealed that the Illithid or the Mind Flayers have rekindled or rediscovered the secret behind the Nautiloids, I'm going to go ahead with the assumption that that's what we see in the background. And back when the Mind Flayers first came to Faerun on their astral travels, Nautiloids were these big mothership type entities that they used to capture, harvest, and convert humanoids and other creatures into Mind Flayers. And that looks exactly like what's happening in the background here, so I'm willing to bet that that's going to feature into the story for Baldur's Gate 3. So let's take a look at a little bit of background around Baldur's Gate itself to understand what else we might expect from the story of Baldur's Gate 3. First of all, Baldur's Gate is hailed by many as the real capital of Faerun, certainly the trade capital. It hugs the Sword Coast, right at the cusp of the River Kyanthar and the Sea of Swords, which makes it premium territory for ships coming and going all along the west coast of Faerun, from the jungles of Chult, the Moonshea Isles, other big capital cities, including Waterdeep along the coast. It's also surrounded by mountain ranges, so it's very protected from both the elements and siege on most of its fronts. Now, the existence of the River Kyanthar and knowing that that is the conduit through which Baldur's Gate conducts trade to the rest of Faerun, it's presumable that this could actually open up the game well into the Western Heartlands and into other areas of familiar territory in the Forgotten Realms. Now, as we know through the release of Descent into Avernus and some of Baldur's Gate's more narrative history, there has always been a rich sense of darkness and a history of evil that underlies daily life in Baldur's Gate, through the coming of Baal to the demonic ingress from the powers of the Nine Hells through Descent of Avernus, left only to the salvation of those two factions I mentioned earlier, the Flaming Fists, which is the mercenary company that holds stead over some of the lower districts of Baldur's Gate, and the Watch, which are the more formal peacekeeping ranks of Baldur's Gate security. So here's some speculation based on my understanding of both the lore and the announcements that we have around Baldur's Gate 3 from Larian Studios. Like I said, it was released at Google Stadia Presser in June as part of their E3 activities. It's confirmed for Stadia and PC, but I'm really hoping that we're going to see this on console as well. I don't think there's any reason not to do it there. It is based on the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set. This has also been confirmed, but of course a very trimmed down version that's designed to work well in a video game format, which of course has different stipulations and structures that need to be understood. The Ceramorphosis that we see in the trailer, in the words of Sven himself, is an accelerated version of Ceramorphosis, and it doesn't typically play out this way. So presumably between this reconnection of the Mind Flayers to their former power and glory with the inception of the Nautiloid, and this transformation that we see happen very rapidly, suggests that there might be a new evolution of this that is threatening Baldur's Gate and, by proxy, the entirety of Faerun. Mike Mearls also confirmed that Descent into Avernus, the previously released campaign for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, is a prequel to this iteration of Baldur's Gate 3. So while the impact that your tabletop games have might not necessarily impact the video game version, lore-wise, there is a sequential flow there. Larian Studios has made quite clear that the release date will be quote-unquote when it's ready, which I actually find promising and refreshing in today's hurried, hustled publishing and development environment for video games. And they've made quite clear that they're not willing to compromise the vision or the integrity of the game to meet a published date. That's really not represented enough in the world of games today. So if you are familiar with the Divinity series from Larian Studios, then you probably also want to know whether and if Dungeon Master mode will be included. DM mode was a really great alternate way to use the game that allowed DMs to actually create and craft playable scenarios. And I know a number of game masters who've actually brought it into their table games as a virtual environment to bring their players into. So, I mean, it's Dungeons & Dragons. It's called Dungeon Master mode. I can't see any iteration of this that's not released with DM mode enabled for Baldur's Gate 3. And finally, I do have faith that because this IP and the Baldur's Gate franchise specifically is so protected, it's such a valuable asset for Wizards that it's really going to get the white glove treatment every step of the way. And Larian Studios is exactly the right developer to make this a reality. Now, the most recent video that we saw from the studio came out through their Twitter account just last week, showing some motion caption, showing some image capture and generation, and at the end, the date of February 27th, 2020. Clearly not a release date. I don't want to get anyone, in a frenzy about that, but presumably some kind of information reveal or update is coming on February 27th, 2020, and large enough so that they made a video teaser about it. So I'm really excited to see what Larian and Wizards is coming out with in regards to Baldur's Gate 3 at the end of the month.